Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks, a live stream program of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. I'm Cal Beisner. I'm the president, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance. Cornwall Alliance is a network of just under 70 evangelical scholars, uh, scientists, economists, statisticians, uh, and theologians and philosophers, all dedicated to educating the public and policymakers about three things simultaneously and intertwined with each other. Those are biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, together with the biblical worldview, the theology, and the ethics that inevitably come along with the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are a nonprofit organization supported entirely by individual donations. And so I would welcome you to consider becoming a donor to the Cornwall Alliance. Invite you to go to cornwallalliance.org and see the many, many different educational articles and major papers that we have available there. We also have a YouTube channel, but let's just stay on the Cornwall website for a moment. As you'll see from what's in front of you on your screen, we have a blog with nearly daily articles, sometimes a couple per day. We have an online store. We have a number of what we call landmark documents, major things that just continue to be useful over long periods of time. And then there's also the opportunity for you to donate. Now, for the month of November, we are offering to send you totally free as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size. This really amazing, wonderful book called Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty by my good friend, good friend David Fowler. He is a lawyer and the president of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. And in fact, he is our guest tonight on the program, and we're going to be discussing his book. To request your free copy of Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply enter promo code 21-11. That's promo code 21-11, or the book title, Recovering the Constitution, and we'll be delighted to send you a free copy of it. Now, what's the best kept secret in the United States Constitution? Well, if you answered the Ninth Amendment, congratulations. Move to the head of the class. Here it is, that pesky, little rarely used amendment. I believe we can show you a shot of the text on our screen here. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's just 21 words. But when federal, state, and local governments increasingly use crises, real or imaginary, as reasons to encroach on Americans' rights to life, liberty, and property, it just could turn into one of the most important parts of the Constitution. When they use appeals to systemic racism or critical race theory or equity or social justice to force all of us not just to treat everyone fairly, but actually to celebrate such things as abortion, homosexuality, and transgenderism, striking deep wounds in both liberty and justice, those 21 words could enable states and citizens to strike back and win. David Fowler offers Americans a template for how to challenge legislative statutes, executive orders, and agency regulations or directives that undermine their rights in his new book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty. It's a book all Americans concerned about the restoration of limited government and the rule of law, of justice, and liberty should read, and then urge their elected officials to read as well. David is the president of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. He's also a former member of the Tennessee State Legislature, and so he brings some of his experiences there into his writing of this book. Uh, love to welcome David to the program tonight. And David, take a minute or two to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Well, thank you, Cal. Probably the best thing is I'm friends with people like you and Debbie, and that's good. Other than the Lord Jesus Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit, but I'm actually a little guy who decided in 1994 to take my law degree and run for political office because I did not like what I was seeing taking place in our state government and around our nation with respect to many of the issues you talked on, in the sense that we're losing our freedoms, losing our government. Things were headed into more and more social chaos, which, of course, since 1994 has only grown exponentially. So I decided to run against a 26-year incumbent, go part-time in my law practice, and served in the state Senate for 12 years, all of those years on the Judiciary Committee, along with other committee functions. And then in 2006, decided that God's purpose for me as a state legislator, state senator, had come to a conclusion, and worked with some people here, including Focus on the Family, to start this organization initially to push the marriage amendment to the Tennessee Constitution. At the time, a lot of states, were passing amendments to the state constitution about marriage. And so I've now been working in the public square, specifically on state policy issues related to marriage and the family, uh, life, and matters of religious conscience for 15 years. So that's what I've been doing. Married and have one daughter and three grandchildren, two of whom are twins and 2 years old, a boy and a girl.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I remember a lot of good times that we had together back when we both lived in Chattanooga
That's
and
right.
involved in things like the Chattanooga Resource Foundation, developing community leaders with solid biblical worldview and ethics. And
Right.
it's just great to have renewed our acquaintance over the last few years since Debbie and I moved
Yeah.
back to Tennessee and left South Florida, coming to where we would have predictably good warm weather in January and February. Well, no, I guess that doesn't really work quite that well, does it?
Well, I will tell a little
Yeah.
story to your viewers on Cal Beisner from our time in Chattanooga. When I was in the Senate, this bill was being debated on the floor, and I was taking the contrary view that basically everybody was saying, if you take the view that Fowler's taking, you're anything but a child of God, and I was distressed, and I thought, I don't think I'm wrong. You may not remember this, Cal, but I went over to the phone on the Senate floor and I called you, and you happened to answer. And I said, Cal, here's the issue. Here's what I'm thinking. Am I just wrong? And in about 3 or 4 minutes, you said, no, blah, 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 blah. And I said, great, feel good about it. Went back, engaged in the debate, and actually the side that I was for prevailed. So you've
Huh.
been a great friend and confidant for a long, long time.
Well, you may raise expectations way too much. I don't think I can be that helpful to too many people in too many circumstances in
Well,
legislative debates. Yeah, right.
you were, because
No
it had to
guarantees.
do with the poor. It actually had to do with the
Uh,
poor and questions of loan sharking and payday loans and car titling and all of those things. And so you
yeah.
were Johnny on the spot. So anyway, I'm
Well,
thankful for
thanks a
that.
lot.
Sure.
Well, now we have your brand new book, Recovering the Constitution: Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty. And it's a fabulous book. I really
Well, thank
enjoyed reading it. Uh,
you. Thank
the use of the Ninth Amendment is a little surprising. I think it's
you.
probably the most neglected part of the Constitution.
It is.
Perhaps other than the preamble, "We the people," it seems to me that the people have kind of disappeared from government, other than going to the voting place, which probably is the least of the things that we the people ought to be doing. But
Yes.
Tell us first, David, about this book.
Mhm.
What was it that got you so curious about the very subject itself
Yeah.
of government agencies usurping powers that the Constitution doesn't give to them, of courts exercising powers that go way beyond those given to them by the Constitution, even really violating the Constitution by way of court orders. What got you so interested in that you were willing to spend what has to have been years of
Yeah.
study
Yeah.
on that very subject?
Well, I didn't start out to do it. Probably like many of your books, you start out to think I'll write an article on something or I'll deal with this issue. But when the Supreme Court in 2015 issued its opinion and its judgment in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, it's not seared into the minds of many Christians or social conservatives as Roe versus Wade would be, or Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But it was the decision in which the court held that the 14th Amendment due process of law provision prohibited states from licensing marriages between a man and a woman only. That it had somehow now become unconstitutional to define marriage and license marriages only between two people of the opposite sex. And that therefore, the conclusion would have been states, if you're going to issue marriage licenses, you have to issue marriage licenses to two people of the same sex. And interestingly, in that opinion, as Chief Justice Roberts pointed out, the court didn't define what a marriage was, nor explain why it kept using the word two, why its logic and constitutional reason wouldn't apply to three or four or polyamorous relationships where one person's married to two and the other person's married to the other two, and so on and so forth. And that so offended my sense of what the Constitution says. It's kind of like, where does that in the Constitution? That's not in the Constitution any more than Roe versus Wade, that it's illegal for states to protect the lives of the unborn. And I said, I've got to do something. I've got a law degree. I'm in this arena. This is a trampling on the jurisdiction of the state. Once you redefine marriage, you're going to have to redefine what a parent is. You're going to have to then redefine the parent-child relationship, and this has no good end to it going into the future. The very first sentence of the case, if people read it, they would be shocked. It's the predicate for the rest of the analysis, and it is this sentence: the Constitution promises liberty. That's the word in the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, along with life and property. Promises liberty to all within its reach, within a lawful realm, to define and express their identity. I thought, well, where does that end? And of course, the point is, though they use the word within a
David,
lawful realm. Yeah.
does that include that I get to define myself as an elephant or a bookcase like what's behind me or something like that? I mean,
I,
if
I
I
would
get to
I would
define my identity, are there no limits to it at all?
Well, that's the question. Part of what's also hidden in there as you read through it is what affirms your dignity. So in your case, if you think you're coal and that coal is a good resource, I guess you could define yourself as a lump of coal and be treated as such. I mean, there is no what troubled me is there's no legal foundation that's drawn from. There's no legal parameter by which you can limit any of those terms, and you can see where it's going to have to go. Everybody has indeed become their own universe, which is actually the statement made in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision in 1992 that the Supreme
Yeah,
Court will be rehearing on December the 1st. And that was the mystery of life passage. Liberty is the
right.
right to define and express your own identity and the meaning of the universe and the world and all of that. And so and that phrase, the
So,
lawful realm. Well, who's going to decide the lawful realm? Obviously, the Supreme Court, not me or you or our legislative bodies. So,
And,
in other
and
words,
David,
we've lost everything. Yeah.
yeah, um, so you would have expected the Supreme Court to draw on uh, some textual background of legal uh,
Hmm.
standards of the
Right.
time of the Constitution to get its definition of liberty. What defined liberty in the legal and political discourse of the late 18th century, the founding period in America?
Well, you've raised an excellent point, and that's why the dissenting justices said, even the Chief Justice, be happy if you're a same-sex couple, but this had nothing to do with the Constitution. Those were his final words of Chief Justice Roberts' dissenting opinion. The word liberty in the common law, and most people don't really know what it is. They may have heard the term, but it's just the
Hmm.
everyday way we kind of do things. You said, David, can you provide some books? And I said, yeah, if you'll help me, pay for my cost. And so we entered into a contract. We didn't get a license from the state to do it, and you didn't get a license to buy my books. People do common law kind of things all the time. And the common law, the Supreme Court has said over and over and over. And in fact, they've said it in a case this year. They've said it in a couple of cases last year and a couple of years before. The, the, the Constitution was framed within the nomenclature of the common law. So they look to the common law to say, well, what would the word liberty mean? Or what would the word due process mean? Or what would the word commerce mean? Or what would the word um, taking, a taking of property mean? They
Hmm.
constantly do that. But in these social questions, beginning with Roe, they ignored the common law. They didn't say, what does the common law define a person as? And so in what they've done is they've infused this word liberty, which at common law meant locomotion, the ability to move around. It was my protection from you, you know, getting mad at me and throwing me in your trunk and, you know, taking me off somewhere. It was what prohibited the government from throwing me in prison without charging me and just leaving me there. That was the idea, the
Yeah.
freedom of movement and locomotion. Well, that has nothing to do with requiring a county clerk or somebody to issue a license. That's not a freedom from government action or freedom from a wrong action by Cal Beisner. That's a freedom to require action by another person. It's completely backwards. So the point of my book is the court has taken this clause that was saying these fundamental rights to life and liberty and property, you can't take them. Cal can't take them. The government can't take them without due process of law, which meant there needs to be a law describing a wrong. Cal throwing me in the trunk of
Hmm.
his car, Cal punching me after the poker game, the police arresting me and
Wait,
throwing me
wait,
in
wait, wait,
prison.
wait. You and
Well,
I
okay.
have not ever been in a poker game.
Okay, yeah, and I haven't been in one since high school football camp, but whatever it might be, you get the gist. Um, uh, um, it said there has to be described a wrong, and then you have to prove the wrong was committed by a fair due process. That's all it was doing, and they've converted this procedural requirement into a substantive concept. They've divorced the words of the due process clause, person, life, liberty, property, from their common law context, and then they inject into them anything that they think you ought to have a liberty to do. And what's interesting, Cal, actually, how we play with words, you'll see now in some of their opinions that they say the the liberty the Constitution guarantees is freedom. Well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about freedom. It talks about liberty. It's a word that it's just like the Bible. If you want to know what a word in the Bible means in the Greek, you need to understand what the Greek meant at the time, not what it might mean today. In fact, the word might not exist in today's Greek lexicon. And that's what our founders were saying. And that's why the Ninth Amendment is so important, because it establishes really a baseline for understanding the whole Constitution as being derived from something outside the words on the piece of paper. And that means law exists apart from any positive enactment, either by a collection of states or the people or by legislative bodies. In fact, when you look at the word enumeration, it implies that there's something already existing, doesn't it? Are you still there? All of a sudden, I can't hear you, Cal. What happened? I wonder.
I had muted
Hello?
my mic for a
Ah,
moment while I was
okay.
taking
Yeah,
care of some
okay.
problems here.
No,
Yeah, you've used the phrase common law,
right,
and you've referred to the Constitution, you've referred to a law, a statute. Um, I'm about to ask you what actually led to your writing the book, and
yeah,
I
that's
think
right. You
we're
were asking me.
probably already partway there.
Yeah,
But before we do that, for those of our listeners who are not, specialists in law, uh,
right,
distinguish for us common law, constitutions,
right.
statutes, and then regulations issued by agencies. How
Yeah,
do these things relate to each other? And if you could
sure.
define common law, I know that's actually a pretty tough thing to do, but if you can
Yeah,
define common law for us, uh,
sure.
give our viewers that help.
Sure. The common law was essentially an acknowledgement that there is a law out there, a transcendent source or basis of law that we come to know through a variety of factors. Particularly, it would have been through our interactions and and um, and the development of situations, and we would look at uh, natural law as it would have been understood, and we would compare those things to revealed or divine law. Blackstone and Koch and all these others would have said, to come up with what the common law was. Now, how the common law came to be known, okay, is judges would have a situation come before them. And so in my book, I gave the example today of dine and dash. That people go into a restaurant, they order a meal, and then they dash out without paying.
Yeah.
And really, the customer and the restaurateur are operating under common law. That when I come into the restaurant, I I see that the restaurant is offering to serve a lobster dinner for $100. And I accept the offer and say, I will pay you $100 if you'll provide me that lobster dinner. There's no
You go to
statute.
you go to fancier restaurants than I do.
Well, I'm thinking back to my lobbyist days, or you go to Wendy's and they put the board up, or the fast food place. But I probably shouldn't promote a particular chain. But there's an offer made and there's an acceptance, and I can't then run out having eaten the meal without paying for it. And really, that's
Yeah.
that's called the breach of promises. We've had an offer and we've had acceptance. God honors His promises. You should honor your promises. And so that's the common law. A judge would have said, Fowler, you get back in here and pay for that hamburger. Okay? Now, I gave another example that another situation comes along and the person orders the hamburger and he's provided the lobster dinner. And he says, I didn't order a hamburger. I didn't offer to pay you for a hamburger. It's on the menu. You gave me something else. I can't afford it. I'm not eating. And I go out of the restaurant. The judge wouldn't have said, well, the last guy left the restaurant without paying, so Fowler, you have to pay. I'd say, no, 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 wait a minute. I made an offer to buy his hamburger that he had put out there, but he provided me something else. I didn't accept his offer. And so I ought not to have to pay for it. And the judge would say, you're right, that's a different situation. The principle never changed, but as the facts changed, we realized, wait a minute, there really wasn't something here. Or maybe the argument would be, well, he made a gift to me of that lobster dinner. Well, now we'd have to look at, is there donative intent? So the law of common law developed. There were these principles that were out there. And the judges were trying to distill what was true, what was false, what was consistent with Scripture. And so They would then issue an opinion, and that was considered evidence of the law. The court opinion was not the law, it was evidence of the law because the judge might be wrong. So, for example, if in my second example, I ordered the hamburger and I got the lobster dinner and left, if a judge made me pay for that, and then the next guy comes along, he orders the hamburger, gets the lobster, says, "Whoa, this is great. Last time this happened, I'm going to go ahead and eat the lobster. I'm going to have to pay for it." And then he dashes. Well, the judge would say, "Well, wait a minute. This is different from the second example because now you actually accepted the lobster and ate the lobster, and you can't now run out and not pay for it." And so judges would say the first judge was maybe wrong. He shouldn't have made you pay for that lobster because you didn't eat it and you left. So that judge was wrong. He got the law wrong. And I would issue
Hmm.
now a new corrective kind of opinion. So that's how law sort of
So
developed. That's common
yeah,
law.
so common law really developed as a whole, series of thousands and thousands of judicial decisions in various different specific disputes,
Right,
bringing principles of equity uh,
right.
under the proper meaning of that term back
That's
before
correct.
the woke movement turned it into equality.
That's
But
right.
equity meaning fairness, impartiality, the equal application of law to everyone.
Right,
So
right,
this was thousands and thousands of judicial decisions, each one of them adding to the body that informs future judges
right,
as they come to handle similar or even identical cases. So that's
right,
common law. Then what
right.
about, and we need to be fairly quick on this,
Yeah.
constitution, statute, and regulation?
Those are all what we'd call positive law enactments. They're things that are written down. Usually, the way it was understood was that the positive law, the enacted statutory law, is trying to reflect what the common law has already said. Okay. So, for example, here's a little example. The law would say today that if I left my wife and daughter, destitute because I've run off, there's a statute that says,
Hmm.
no, you need to pay child support and alimony. Well, we didn't just dream that up out of our head. The common law had said, wait a minute, there are rights and duties that arise when David and Linda enter into this marital agreement. And part of those rights and duties extend to their children when they have them. And so, even at common law, the judge would have said, David, you've got to pay for your child. There's a relationship here, and there are duties here that they arise in the very nature of this thing. The statute would have clarified, well, okay, well, 10% ought to be it all the time. We're not going to have judges, 10% of the income, 20% of the income, 40% one day, 2% the next. So we created statutes. But those
Hmm.
are now words that have already distilled the principle. So the judge now only has to decide what does that word mean, and given what the word means, how does that apply to this restaurateur in this diner? In the other case, he didn't have any words but prior opinions, and he's trying to distill this idea of keeping promises, making offers, accepting offers, fulfilling your
Hmm.
promises. How's that different from a donation or a gift? And so the judges were reading all these cases and trying to look at the facts to say, okay, here's how that basic, fundamental, universal, unchanging principle now applies to this fact, now applies to these facts, now applies to these facts. But the statute
Okay.
has already put all that together.
Okay.
And that's what's the problem is the court now is ignoring the written words and putting new meaning into them, which means our Constitution is being amended by the Supreme Court all the time.
Now, it seems to me that the Constitution is it's certainly above statutes,
That's right.
but in a sense, it's actually below the common law, and I think that's what the Ninth Amendment gets at.
That's right.
Is precisely that common law supersedes Constitution. So we've got common law as really the overarching, transcendent, unchanging thing that is the attempt uh, to enunciate in specific cases the principles
Right.
of divine justice. as
That's right.
revealed in the Holy Scriptures. And perhaps if someone embraces this idea, the idea of natural law, this God-given law that is written in the heart of every man, as Paul puts it
Right.
in Romans 2. And then, so we've got common law, constitution, statute, and then below that, agency regulations, and maybe even below that, uh, executive orders, whether by a president or a governor or a mayor or whatever. We've
Right.
got all these different levels of law, but and then of course there are judicial decisions which are not in and of themselves law. Have I got
That's
that
right.
right? Judicial
That is
decisions are
correct.
not law. They are interpretations and applications of law, even though now we often say, well, such and such Supreme Court decision is the law of the land. And that's
That's
taken
right.
from, I think, a misreading of the supremacy clause
That's
of the
correct.
Constitution. Now,
Right.
we could spend a long time talking about all of these different
Right.
parts of law and quasi law, but at this point, I want to jump to, okay, so why did you decide actually to write the book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty?
Well, I had this vague notion because years ago, actually, not long after I first met you and went through this leadership class in 1990, I think it was, I got Blackstone's commentaries and I started reading them about the common law. I really wasn't taught any of that in law school. A lot of lawyers are not. In fact, this friend of mine who graduated from UVA, a renowned law school, she said, I asked in my con law class what common law was, and they said, well, we don't do that and believe in that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I have right there.
Yep.
And
Here,
so
by the
so
way,
I'd
this
read
is
it years
this is
ago.
my first volume of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. Yes.
That's right. So I had read those, and so when the Supreme Court came out with this opinion, I remembered a funny little story. When my dad remarried after my mom died, he married this widow lady, and they were both in their 60s. And after the service, the minister said, "David and John, bring your license and your certificate of marriage back to my office before the reception." And Dad said, "What license?" And he said, "Oh, you don't have a license." And he said, "No, what do I need one for? I'm 60 years old. I've done this before. She's done it before. I don't want one." And the minister was horrified. Now, this was telling. He said, "Are y'all going to spend the night together?" And Dad looked at him and said, "Yeah, I just got married in front of God and you and 300 people in that sanctuary." But see, he didn't think you could get married, that what you did in that service was a nullity as far as recognizing anything existed. And that came back to me after Obergefell. And I thought, what did we do before we got licenses? Why does the state have to issue a license? How can the judicial branch tell a legislative branch you have to pass a law? That seems to violate the whole concept of separation of powers and the independence of each of the branches. And that's when I remembered the common law. And I remembered Blackstone talking about the three primary economic private relationships at the common law were master servant employment relationships, husband and wife, and parent and child. So I went back and started reading it. And then I started thinking, well, the Supreme Court refers to the common law all the time, and I just started reading back through the Constitution. And I got to the Ninth and the 10th Amendment because I figured something had to do with the 10th Amendment. The powers reserved to the states, and now you've usurped the power we've already had. And I read the Ninth Amendment, and I just began to read it and think about it. You don't have to have a law degree to make some sense out of it. That and so that's where it started. Now, what happened then is in 2019, states started passing heartbeat bills. So I've been working on this for 4 years, thinking it through, and how does it apply to the marriage situation? How could we apply it to challenge this Obergefell idea that marriage can be redefined by the Constitution and the Supreme Court? And all these heartbeat bills made me stop and think, well, wait a minute. At common law, there's a right to life, liberty, and property. Those are the ones that are there. And that then brought me back to the Ninth Amendment again. And I said, well, there it is. The common law said, and I remembered this from reading Blackstone, that the unborn were persons in the eyes of the law for many purposes and treated as if already born. So that should inform the meaning of the word person in the due process clause. And we know what life is. Blackstone said life is that which comes from the Creator. And I realized, well, my goodness, Roe didn't talk about any of those things. And so they only talked about the 14th Amendment and ignored the common law, but the Ninth Amendment is clearly referring to the common law.
Yeah.
So I realized, well, this will apply now to abortion. And that's what made me then begin to realize the Ninth Amendment can apply to any number of things, including, for example, these COVID vaccine mandates. The federal government has no authority to force any individual person to the touching of their limbs and their body. That's part of common law. And so that's really what led to the book, was I realized I was into something that could apply to any number of things and actually push back against the court and say to the court, you've interpreted the 14th Amendment in abortion and in marriage and in all these other things, but you've never considered the relationship between the Ninth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. And if I can get legislative bodies to pass laws in reliance on that, and attorney generals to defend those laws in reliance on the Ninth Amendment, the 14th Amendment cases cannot be controlling precedents because it was never considered.
Yeah.
And I'd have a new shot in front of the court.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. For those of you who've just recently joined us, I want to just get you some context here. We're discussing David Fowler's brand new book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty. Now, I know this is not the typical sort of subject that you expect from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We're not a law think tank or something like that. But I want to tell you why I think that this is very important to our own work. And that is that a great deal of statutory law, of regulations from federal, state, and even local agencies, subsets of the administrative branch, and judicial rulings, a lot of these have a great impact on environmental issues. A lot of these concern environmental issues. And many of them transgress what I believe are the constitutional boundaries of our federal, state, and local governments, and really lack proper grounding, proper support in the Constitution of the United States or in the various state constitutions. Many agency rulings lack proper grounding in statutes, whether of Congress or of state legislatures and so on. And so, frankly, what we have is a sort of a chaotic, do your own thing situation going on in law that affects environmental issues, but it affects plenty of other issues as well, whether life itself for the born or the unborn, whether marriage, whether religious liberty, and so many other things. David just mentioned the whole issue of whether governments have a constitutional authority to mandate vaccines. And there is a case from, I think it was 1905, where the Supreme Court ruled that a mandate for a smallpox vaccine was admissible, but that seems to have been because it was a relatively minor burden on anybody, in that the fine for refusing to be vaccinated was actually pretty much nominal. I believe it was $20. Whereas now what we're seeing is mandates that are backed by the threat of losing your job if you will not get vaccinated, not being allowed to return to school, whether primary, secondary, or collegiate or graduate. These are not small burdens. And our Supreme Court has talked about the necessity of applying a strict criterion where the burden is great. So, this is why I wanted to have David on the show tonight to discuss these things. So, David,
Mhm.
can you? Oh, and by the way, yeah, I should
Mhm.
remind you all of this too, that through the end of November, we at the Cornwall Alliance will gladly send a free copy of David's book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty, as our way of saying thanks when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size. To request yours, go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form with whatever amount you want to donate, simply in the comments field, enter promo code 21-11. That's promo code 21-11. That's for 2021 and the 11th month, November. Or else write in the title, Recovering the Constitution, and we'll be glad to send you an absolutely free copy. This is, I think, a very understandable book for non lawyers, non specialists in law. And yet, I think it's a book that drives right down to the very root of law and is the promise of a recovery of the limited government, the small government that our founding fathers intended us to have. I just was reading the Federalist Papers. I've been rereading them recently over a period of weeks. And yesterday I reread Federalist number 62, and in it, James Madison warns very vigorously against the multiplication of laws so that they become so many that nobody could possibly know them all, and the changing of them so frequently that even if you knew what a law was today, you might not know what it is tomorrow. All of these things being done by legislatures that have essentially lost their moorings in the basic fundamental principles of law, in the idea of justice. And I think that this is very important for all Americans to understand. And this is why I'm so glad to offer David's book and to have David on the program tonight to discuss it with us. David, give us one example um, of a specific law. You've mentioned Roe v. Wade. You've mentioned Obergefell v.
Hodges.
Let's see, Hodges.
Hodges. Right.
Yeah, Hodges. You've mentioned those two. Can you give us another example of a court ruling, reasonably recent, or if it's not all that recent, remind us all of what it involved,
Hmm.
where you would judge that the ruling flew in the face of common law and therefore of the law that is actually above the Constitution. And I remember, by the way, that there were some people who were dismayed that Antonin Scalia would think that there was such a thing as natural law that is actually superior to the Constitution, transcends it. I don't think any of our founding fathers would have been dismayed at that at all. But tell us a law that contradicts the common law, or a judicial ruling that contradicts the
Hmm.
common law, and explain how that happens and how
Okay.
the use of the Ninth Amendment, the way you prescribe in your book, would help us to undo that.
Okay. Here's one that might someday apply to you or your 70 scholars, and it's the law of slander. Saying something false about somebody. Okay. The
Okay.
the the Supreme Court in a case called Times versus New York, Sullivan versus New York Times, I think it was.
Times
This
v.
was
Sullivan. Yeah.
Times v. Sullivan. Yeah, many years ago. The Supreme Court decided that a newspaper couldn't be liable for damages to my reputation unless what it said was so reckless or knowingly false. Okay. Now, the
Now,
common law did.
let me just interject there, if I can, for a
Okay.
moment. As a former newspaper editor and publisher and reporter,
Hmm.
I'm pretty familiar with Times v. Sullivan. It was
Right,
1962,
right,
and
right,
what you just enunciated as a limitation on the liability of a newspaper or a TV news station or
right.
whatever for libel or slander
Hmm.
applies specifically to public figures, not
Right.
to private individuals. I mean,
That's right.
it doesn't apply
That's
to your next door neighbor unless he happens to be a member of Congress or something like that.
that's right.
And what it says is that these media are uh, are essentially not liable unless the target, the
Right.
victim, so to speak, can prove that the media said something defamatory, knowing at the time that it said it that it was false,
Right.
and with reckless disregard for the truth,
Right.
and with malice aforethought. You had to have all three of those. You know it
Yeah.
was false, you had reckless disregard for the truth, and you had malice aforethought. And this was specifically about public figures. And the reason that the court held that sort of thing is that it considered that allowing public figures to sue and prevail for slander or libel, slander being oral, libel being written, allowing them to do that would stifle public debate about politics and candidates for office and all of that sort of thing. And we don't want to do that, right? We want to
Right.
have very, very open public debate. Now, I
Right.
remember some of your discussion of this in your book, and frankly, you you changed my thinking on this because as a
Mm.
former journalist, I took shelter in
Sure.
Times v. Sullivan. Not that I ever, with reckless disregard for the truth,
Right.
malice aforethought, and told a falsehood that was defamatory about anybody. Never did that. I
Right.
did get accused of it once. And when my lawyer wrote back to the big New York City law firm and kind of gave them a kindergarten lesson in libel law, they just went silent forever after
Sure.
that.
Sure.
But you persuaded me that that was not a good ruling by the
Mm.
Supreme Court. So tell us how the common law treats that.
Yeah. There are multiple things really in that ruling. The first is, why does the First Amendment apply to the states? That's the first question. Where did that come from? It was understood that the Bill of Rights, the enumeration of rights, only applied as a limitation on the federal government. It had nothing to do with state laws. So the state common law would have been different. They would have said, was what you said false? And did it cause damage? The fact
Mhm.
is that just because I'm a former state senator and, I've got a website and blah, 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 doesn't mean that if you go out there and call me something terrible and I lose all my donors, that, well, that's fair game. Yeah, maybe they should have checked. Maybe they should have called somebody to say, did he really have an affair with you before we published it? But I'd still be damaged, right? Just like your neighbor would be damaged.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm damaged worse, but I couldn't recover. So they added something to the common law that wasn't there. So you have two problems there. First of all, you have the Supreme Court using the due process clause to substantively drag into the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment, which has also affected the whole religious establishment issues and all of that,
Yes.
guns and so on and so forth. The first problem is the court. What was the authority constitutionally for the court to take away from the states their jurisdiction to decide how to handle common law libel and slander cases? And then
Hmm.
what gave the Supreme Court, having taken away that authority, to add to the requirements that common law didn't have? That's just a flat amendment of the Constitution. Now, one of the things that, Cal, I need to say, and I told you before we got on the show, we have chosen to live under a constitution that's been rewritten by our United States Supreme Court. And here's what I mean by that. you've touched on it before. The judicial power is the only power the court has. When you get to the Federalist Papers that you're reading, you'll see, I think it's in either 78 or 81, that Hamilton says that the legislative branch is the least powerful and the least dangerous because it has neither force nor will. Now, that was never explained to me in law school. In fact, we didn't even read the Federalist Papers. I don't remember us talking about it. But the idea is the executive branch has force. It's supposed to execute the law. Okay? The legislative power has what would be considered will. They can say, this is the law and it now applies to everybody. Everybody has to get a driver's license. Okay? But the court only has the judicial power, which was one of judgment, to decide a specific dispute between particular parties in the courtroom, and their remedy, their judgment as to who should win or lose, cannot extend to all the people. If it extended to all the people, that would be then the making of a law. That's the legislative branch. What we've allowed the Supreme Court to do, and I don't know if I covered it in the book. I think I did in Chapter 7. There's a case called Cooper v. Aaron in 1958 where the Supreme Court said, not only do we have the authority to determine, independent of the executive and the legislative branch, what the law ought to be, or how we understand the law to resolve this dispute between David and Cal, but they said, but that also meant we get to decide what the Constitution means for everybody in the whole country. And that now makes it the supreme law, not the written words of the Constitution. And our legislative branches of the federal government and of the states act as if the judicial power can make law for the whole nation. And Abraham Lincoln said, I put it in a quote in there, that when we allow the policy on vital questions affecting the whole of the people to be decided by a court in private litigation between private parties to be the policy for everybody, we will have resigned our government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. And that's exactly what's happened. We no longer say, well, this decision is so far off from the common law understanding of the words persons and liberty and property and so on and so forth, that we're going to say, well, I'm sure sorry that guy lost that case, but we're not doing that as to anybody else. How else did this happen? Let me give you an example. Courts rewriting the absentee ballot laws. That happened all over the country. The legislature would say, you can get an absentee ballot if you're sick or you're caring for somebody that's sick, and you can't come. Maybe those were the two exceptions. Well, people were coming into court and saying, yeah, but I'm afraid I'm going to get sick. Well, there isn't any exception in the statute for that. So the court would say, well, Mr. Beisner, because you have asthma or whatever it is, I can see why you don't want to show up. I'm going to tell the registrar to let you vote early. Well, that was wrong. You just rewrote the law for Mr. Beisner. But then he turned around and said, and, election commissioner, that is now the law for everybody in the whole state of Tennessee. Not everybody in the whole state of Tennessee was in front of the court. The court couldn't have power over everybody. It rewrote a law for everybody. That was all unconstitutional. And our legislature in Tennessee complained about it, and the Bar Association and the bench and the leadership in the state house killed it. That judge should have been impeached.
So in your book, you outline some steps that state legislatures and executives can take to, for one thing, to shield a law from judicial overturning, invalidation, something like that. You point out, for instance, that a law still is on the books, even after a court rules somehow or other that it's unconstitutional. It's still the law. And you outline how state legislatures and governors can fight back against the courts and keep using that law despite a contrary ruling. Outline that for us.
Well, Cal, that's a really important point you just raised, and the the point is this, and this is the example that I've given in the abortion context. For example, when in Roe the Supreme Court said the Texas law violated the woman's privacy right, that really should have only applied to Jane Roe, but they people in other states began to treat it as if that judgment was against the state of Tennessee or the state of Florida. Well, that's not true. It wasn't. And so what a state is free to do is to look at the rationale and say, wow, this is what Abraham Lincoln said. This is really well reasoned. I hadn't even thought about this, but they're right. This is what the common law said liberty was, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to enforce my law either, because I know I'll lose. I don't have a better argument. But when the court makes a bad argument, once they've given you the bad argument, you now know, oh, don't make the bad argument. Here's a better one. Or I'm going to stop and think of a better one. And then I'm going to keep enforcing my law, and I'm going to go back and say, Texas didn't make a very good argument. I'm going to make this one. And you didn't think about this one. That's what I was trying to do with the Ninth Amendment, is say nobody on the court has ever thought about the Ninth Amendment. Everything that I can pass in the legislature that rests in the rights that were retained by the people and the powers reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment to protect those rights, I am bringing a new situation to the court, and I'm saying, I don't care what you've said in the past. You didn't think about this. I've given this example of stare decisis and precedent this way for the layperson. Dad tells you,
Stare
son, you can't.
decisis means
It
stare
means the thing
decisis
that's
means
settled. It means the thing that's settled should stay settled. So once we've decided
let the
something,
decision stand.
let the decision stand. So you go to Dad and you say, Dad, I want to go to the prom, and he says, son, you can't go to the prom unless you're making all B's, and now that's a precedent, right? So I go to Dad and I say, Dad, I got 4 B's and 1 C, and he said, son, that's already been decided. Stare decisis, precedent. You got to have all B's. Well, there's no point in going back to Dad with 4 B's again, right? And a C. You just don't point in it. But I said, let's assume the little lady next door who's an invalid and can't walk, and she's in the upper room of her house and it catches on fire, and you run across and you climb up the stairs and carry her to safety and go back in for her putty cat, and bring it out. And now when I go to Dad and say, Dad, I got 4 B's and a C, but you know what? What you were really interested in was my sense of responsibility and drive and energy and integrity. And, I saved that poor woman from death. And Dad say, well, I never thought about that, son. So yeah, you can go to the prom with 4 B's and a C because of what you showed me in that other thing. That's how stare decisis would work. And so anytime we can rely on the Ninth Amendment, I've been trying to help state legislators on COVID, rely on the Ninth Amendment and the right to personal security, which included your life, your limb, your body, your health. That's why we have informed consent laws for medical procedures, because nobody can touch my body without my consent. Rely on the Ninth Amendment. Tell Joe Biden, I don't care what the Commerce Clause says, but it cannot take away from the state my ability, my duty as a legislator to protect my people from an unauthorized, unapproved touching of their body. Go away.
Because the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall
That's
not
right.
be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's
That's right.
that's what is so crucial. I I don't know how often the Ninth Amendment has ever been cited in
Never.
judicial decisions. I assume very, very rarely. But
Yeah.
I think you've opened up an enormous treasure trove here of ammunition against judicial absolutism
That's right.
that is I think very promising, and I have every hope that your book and others that will grow out of it, I hope,
Mm-hmm.
will have increasing impact in America. I know as much as 40 years ago, as I was studying totally informally, but I was studying constitutional law. I was studying, the history of Supreme Court cases on constitutional law, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And at the time, I was thinking to myself, I'll bet you 98% of what the federal government does is not in the enumerated powers and therefore is unconstitutional. And we've just all gotten accustomed to it.
That's right.
And, for the restoration of civil liberty, as your book title puts it,
Right.
we desperately need to have a revival, a resurrection of the Ninth Amendment. Yeah.
Yes.
So I just enormously appreciate your book, David,
Well,
and
thank
I
you.
hope that many, many people will get it and read it carefully. Lay people, non-lawyers don't need to think that somehow or other this is going to be beyond them. I'm a non-lawyer, and it wasn't beyond me. I enjoyed reading it very, very much, and
And there are
I
pictures
just
in the back. Remember?
yeah
I don't know if you remember. There are pictures, diagrams. If you can't read it, look at the picture.
yeah right yeah
No.
it's a wonderful book, David.
Oh, thank you.
Do
Thank
you
you.
have some closing comments for our viewers?
Yeah.
Advice, encouragement? Do you see any developments on the judicial horizon, on the political horizon, that indicate that we may be moving toward a paring back of government overreach?
I would say a couple of things as a first point for the Christian out there. The Ninth Amendment is a recognition that law exists outside the positive declarations of human beings.
Yeah,
And when Christians don't believe in that and give that idea up, they've given up the game. I mean, that's just it. And that's what we've done. We've given up the game. And I've
yeah.
told people, here's a simple thing to do. Next time somebody starts talking about their constitutional rights, say, well, I'm concerned about my enumerated rights. And they're likely to say, what do you mean your enumerated rights? You mean your constitutional rights? No, my enumerated rights. Because, see, the Constitution doesn't give me any rights. It simply lists the ones I had prior to the Constitution and says they continue on. My rights exist apart from and prior to the Constitution. And see, you open the door then to talk about the fact that there is a law that we all know is there. I can't just run into the restaurant, order my meal, eat it, and run out. We all know that's wrong. And so it opens that door. That's just a simple way for everybody to start. Don't talk about your constitutional rights because it feeds the notion in our culture that our rights come from the Constitution because somebody wrote them in a document. That's not true.
So we
That's
should
a
be
practical
we
tip.
should be asserting not just our enumerated rights, but also our unenumerated rights,
That's right.
right?
That's
And
right.
if we're not willing to do that, frankly, we lose the capacity to do exactly what the apostles did
That's right.
when the governing authorities ordered them to stop preaching the gospel, and they said, "We must obey God rather than men."
That's right.
Acts 5:29.
That's right.
You get rid of this sense of common law as transcendent and universal and unchanging, and therefore superior even to the Constitution, let alone to statutes, to agency regulations, to executive orders. Uh, Forget about that. And you cannot ever again say, well, I must obey God rather than men. The whole notion of religious liberty, of freedom of conscience, disappears completely. Didn't mean to
That's right.
interrupt you there, David,
No,
but
no,
I wanted to drive home that.
no.
Go ahead
I say that.
with your closing
The
comment.
other thing is that we should do is try to educate as many people as we can. As I said, I tried to write the book as non-technical as possible, but with enough in it that if a lawyer picked it up, he wouldn't say, you didn't think about any of this. So some of the stuff, um, but it'll help you understand this doctrine of stare decisis we've talked about. It'll help you understand the nature of the common law, and you need to begin to understand yourself. one of my favorite quotes from de Tocqueville was that if the lights that go out, they'll go out gently over time, and we'll be left with wise procedures and no understanding of why they're there, and we'll make a clumsy and unintelligent use of them. And that's what happens. So get the book and read it, which I appreciate you encouraging people to do. I would encourage people to talk to their legislative officials about this. Some of them will get it. There are many who are now looking for ways to say, how do I push back against the federal government? How do I push back against the Supreme Court? What can I do? I see that in my own network of policy people that they don't know what to do. So buy them the book, give it to your legislator. That's one of the things that you can do as well. And then, lastly, I would always say that pray that God will raise up people who will run for office. When I ran for office 26 years ago, I had never even been to a political meeting. I'd never met one of my local elected officials. Now, I'm not just saying, just go out here and collect names and just run. You need to feel called of God to do it. But we have too few people that even think about God could call me to this ministry of the magistrate. But that's the word used in Romans 13, the diakonos of God. And so just like I support what Cornwall is doing because you are engaged in a ministry every bit as much, though of a different nature than the person in the pulpit. And that's what I'm doing too. So I actually give a couple of laws in the back that you cut out the back pages and take them to your legislators on abortion and on marriage. Those are things you could do. And of course, the scripture tells us to pray for all those that are in authority over us. And we need to pray for them. So those are just some of my thoughts. I don't think any of this is above anybody's head, and you don't have to despair that, well, I didn't go to law school, so I can't understand it. And you've made that clear tonight yourself. Looks like our sound's getting all messed up here, Cal.
I
Is
think
that on
we're,
the end?
yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry about
Sorry
that.
about that. Yeah, I
Oh,
accidentally
really?
touched a
Oh, okay.
cursor on my
Oh,
laptop here.
okay.
Well, again, David, thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining us this evening. I do wish you the best with this book and with all that you're doing with the Family Action Council of Tennessee. FACTN, FACTN.org. I strongly recommend that all of our viewers go there, whether they're in Tennessee or not. They can pick up a lot of really good principles, good ideas, good working ideas for use in their own states. David Fowler, my good friend for about 30 some years now.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining
Back
us
when our
tonight.
hair was all dark.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, indeed.
That's
Um,
right.
very good.
Thank you,
Again,
Cal.
thank you, David. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And for all of you, thanks again for joining us tonight. Next week, we have, I think, a very exciting guest. He's one of my favorite scientists. He's Dr. Christopher Essex. He is professor of both applied mathematics and physics at the University of Western Ontario in Ontario, Canada, and has written a great deal in the climate change controversies. And he's going to explain to you and to me, to all of us, why he has essentially decided to bail out from the controversies over climate science. And then he's going to talk with us about some of his own favorite scientific concepts, the things that really keep him curious and learning all the time. He's just an incredibly brilliant man. And I intend to learn a whole lot next week just listening to him. And he's actually going to be here in my home. So the two of us will be on the same computer at the same time. We'll be having a very, I think, a fun and open conversation with each other. So that'll be next week on From the Stacks. One more reminder, David Fowler's book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty, is our special offer, free copy of this as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance by the end of November, by midnight on the last day of November. To request your copy, go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, enter promo code 2111 or the book title, Recovering the Constitution, and we'll be delighted to send you a copy. Thank you again for joining us tonight. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may you thrive in walking with Jesus Christ today and every day.